They called her crazy, they called her foolish. They said she was throwing away her inheritance on weeds. But Clara Whitmore was 19 years old, standing alone in the middle of 40 acres of prime Kansas wheatland, and she had a secret that nobody else understood. A secret so simple, so ancient, that the modern world had forgotten it ever existed. And when the state banned every chemical pesticide in the county, when the locusts came in clouds so thick they blocked out the sun, when every single farm around her turned to dust and ruin, Clara's field remained standing, green, alive, thriving. This is the story of how one young woman, laughed at by an entire town, saved not just her own farm, but the future of agriculture in Butler County. Clara Whitmore inherited the Whitmore family farm on a Tuesday morning in late March 1987. Her father had died of a sudden heart attack 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind a mountain of debt, a broken-down combine harvester, and a wheat field that had been treated with the same chemical cocktail for 20 years. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt. The bank wanted their money. The neighbors wanted the land. And Clara, barely out of high school, with her mother's old gardening books and a stubborn streak wider than the Kansas horizon, had exactly 90 days to make the first payment or lose everything her family had built since 1923. The morning after the funeral, Clara walked the 40 acres with her father's muddy boots on her feet and his weathered straw hat on her head. The wheat was coming up patchy and yellow, the soil beneath it hard as concrete, the earthworms gone, the birds silent. She knelt down and grabbed a handful of dirt. It smelled like nothing, like dust and chemicals and death. Her father had been a good man, a hard-working man, but he had trusted the agricultural salesmen who came in their shiny trucks, promising higher yields and pest-free fields. He had sprayed and sprayed until the soil forgot how to be soil. Clara went to the county extension office that afternoon. She sat in a plastic chair while Mr. Harlan, the county agent, shuffled papers and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not unkindly, "your father's yields were down 40% last year. The soil is depleted. The pest resistance is through the roof. My recommendation is you sell to Jensen Farms. They'll give you a fair price, and you can go to college, start a new life." Clara didn't blink. "I want to restore the land, Mr. Harlan. I want to farm it the way my grandmother did." Mr. Harlan laughed, actually laughed. "Your grandmother farmed with mules and manure, Clara. This is 1987. The world runs on chemicals and combines now. You can't compete without them. I don't want to compete the way my father did." Clara said quietly, "I want to compete the way the land wants me to." She left with a pamphlet on conventional wheat farming and a list of chemical suppliers. She threw the pamphlet in the trash and walked 3 miles to the town library instead. There, in the dusty agriculture section, she found what she was looking for. A book from 1948, written by a woman named Eleanor Marsh, about companion planting and native wildflowers in grain fields. The old woman in the black and white photograph on the cover had kind eyes and dirt under her fingernails. Clara read the entire book in one sitting. The concept was beautiful in its simplicity. Before chemical pesticides existed, farmers planted strips of wildflowers between their crops. The flowers attracted predatory insects, lacewings, and parasitic wasps that ate the pests. They brought in pollinators that increased yields. Their deep roots broke up hard-pan soil and brought nutrients to the surface. Their fallen leaves became mulch. They were not weeds. They were partners. Clara spent her last $300 on wildflower seeds. Not just any wildflowers, but native Kansas prairie species that had grown alongside wheat for 10,000 years. Blazing Star, wild bergamot, black-eyed Susan, prairie clover, and milkweed. She bought enough to plant 2 acres of her 40 in wildflower strips, running between the wheat rows like rivers of color. The planting took her 4 days. She worked from sunrise to sunset, her hands blistered, her back screaming, her heart singing. She planted the seeds by hand, pressing them into the earth with her bare fingers, whispering to them like her grandmother used to whisper to her tomatoes. When she finished, she stood at the edge of her field and watched the sunset paint the bare soil gold. Somewhere beneath that soil, life was waking up. The trouble started the following week. Earl Jensen, who owned the 600-acre spread to the east, saw the wildflower strips from the road and nearly drove his pickup into the ditch. He stomped up to Clara's porch that evening, his face the color of raw beef, his fists clenched around his John Deere cap. "Girl," he roared, "what in God's name have you done to your wheat field?" Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've planted wildflowers, Mr. Jensen, native prairie flowers. They'll help with the pests and—" "Help?" Earl Jensen's laugh was like a bark. "You've planted weeds in your wheat field. Do you know what those things will do? They'll choke out your crop. They'll attract every bug in the county. They'll drop your yield to nothing. They're not weeds," Clara said, her voice steady. "They're companion plants. They attract beneficial insects that eat the harmful ones. My grandmother used to." "Your grandmother was a nice old lady who grew tomatoes in her backyard," Earl snapped. "This is commercial farming, Missy. This is how you make a living. You think some pretty flowers are going to pay the bank? You think wildflowers are going to put food on your table?" He turned and stomped back to his truck, shaking his head. "Mark my words," he called over his shoulder. "By July, you'll be begging me to buy that land, and I won't offer you half what it's worth." The rumors spread through Butler County like wildfire. At the grain elevator, the old farmers gathered in their flannel shirts and seed caps, shaking their heads over cups of coffee that tasted like diesel fuel. "Did you hear about Whitmore's girl?" they'd say. "Planted daisies in her wheat field." "Daisies, can you believe it? Poor Howard," they'd mutter, referring to Clara's father. "Worked his whole life to build that farm, and his daughter turns it into a flower garden. She's 19, someone would always add, as if that explained everything. 19 and thinks she knows better than men who've been farming for 40 years. At the hardware store, the clerk rang up Clara's purchase of a hand scythe and raised an eyebrow. "Heard you're growing wildflowers, Miss Whitmore. You know we sell Roundup, right? Kills weeds dead in 24 hours. "They're not weeds," Clara said, for what felt like the 100th time. Sure, the clerk said, smirking. "Good luck with your garden." Even the preacher mentioned it in church, though not by name. "Pride goeth before destruction," he intoned from the pulpit, looking directly at Clara in the third pew, "and a haughty spirit before a fall. Let us remember that wisdom comes with age and experience, not youthful fancy." Clara sat through the sermon with her hands folded in her lap, her jaw set, her eyes dry. She had cried all her tears at her father's funeral. She would not cry for these people. She would show them. She had to show them. The bank payment was due in 70 days. May arrived warm and dry. The wheat came up in neat green rows, and between them, the wildflower seeds began to sprout. Tiny green shoots at first, no bigger than Clara's pinky finger. Then, as the days lengthened and the Kansas sun poured down its golden fire, they began to grow. By early June, the 2 acres of strips were a riot of color. Purple blazing star reached toward the sky like torches. Yellow black-eyed Susan nodded in the wind. White wild bergamot released its minty perfume into the hot air. Orange butterfly weed drew monarchs from 3 counties away. The effect on the wheat was immediate and miraculous. Where the wildflowers grew, the wheat seemed greener, thicker, healthier. The stalks were sturdier, the heads fuller. Clara walked her field every morning at dawn, and every morning she found new signs of life. Ladybugs clustered on the milkweed, hundreds of them, their red shells like drops of blood against the green. Lacewings fluttered through the air, delicate and deadly to aphids. Tiny parasitic wasps, no bigger than gnats, laid their eggs in the corn earworm larvae that had plagued her father's fields for years. She found earthworms again, fat and pink, turning the soil beneath the wildflower roots. She found beetles and spiders and praying mantises. The soil, which had smelled like death in March, now smelled rich and dark and alive, like a forest floor after rain. She brought handfuls of it to her nose and breathed deep, and something ancient in her blood recognized it as home. But the town saw none of this. The town saw a girl who had planted weeds in her wheat field. The town saw a fool. Earl Jensen organized a meeting at the Grange Hall in mid-June. He invited every farmer in the county, and most of them came, drawn by the promise of free coffee and the chance to gossip about the Whitmore girl. Clara wasn't invited, but she heard about it from Mrs. Patterson at the post office, who pressed a warm cinnamon roll into her hand and whispered, "You be careful, dear. They're saying terrible things." Clara didn't go to the meeting. She had weeds to pull and insects to count and soil to feed. But she heard about it the next day from Tom Garrett, the young veterinarian who sometimes helped her with the farm's one remaining mule. Tom was 22, fresh out of Kansas State, and he had a kind face and honest eyes. "They're calling it the flower folly," Tom told her, leaning on her fence as the sun went down. "Earl Jensen says you're destroying property values. Says if the county allows this, next thing you know, we'll all be growing petunias instead of wheat." Clara laughed despite herself. "Petunias wouldn't survive a Kansas summer, Tom. These are native species. They've evolved with the prairie. They belong here." "They don't understand that," Tom said gently. "They see different and they get scared. My professor at K-State, Dr. Miriam Holt, she's been studying integrated pest management. She'd love to see what you're doing. But the old guard, they don't want to hear it." "Let them laugh," Clara said, looking out at her field, where the blazing star was beginning to open its purple spikes. "The flowers are doing their job. The wheat is doing its job. In 2 months, we'll see who's laughing." July brought a heat wave that turned the Kansas sky white and made the asphalt roads shimmer like rivers. The wheat headed out, the golden grain swelling in the hot sun. And in the wildflower strips, the ecosystem Clara had planted was now a thriving metropolis of beneficial insects. She counted 17 different species of predatory beetles in 1 square meter. She found bird nests in the milkweed, filled with chicks being fed caterpillars by their parents. The wildflowers had become an island of life in a sea of chemical monoculture. But July also brought the locusts. They came from the southwest on a hot wind, a living cloud that darkened the sky and sounded like a freight train made of wings. The old-timers had never seen anything like it. Not in Kansas, not in their lifetimes. The grasshoppers were the size of sparrows, their bodies striped yellow and black, their appetites insatiable. They descended on the county like a biblical plague, devouring everything green in their path. Earl Jensen lost 40 acres of soybeans in 6 hours. The insects stripped the leaves, the stems, the pods, leaving behind skeletal plants that crumbled to dust at the touch. The Miller brothers, who farmed wheat to the north, watched in horror as their crop disappeared under a crawling carpet of destruction. The Hendersons, the Bakers, the Coopers, every farm in Butler County was under attack. The farmers fought back with everything they had. They sprayed malathion, diazinon, parathion. They called in crop dusters that painted the sky white with chemical fog. They burned tires at the edges of their fields, trying to smoke the insects out. Nothing worked. The locusts kept coming, wave after wave, eating and breeding and eating again. And then, on the 3rd day of the invasion, the state environmental office made an announcement that turned the county's desperation into panic. The chemicals being used to fight the locusts, they said, had been found to contain contaminants linked to groundwater pollution. Effective immediately, all pesticide applications were banned in Butler County until further notice. No exceptions. No appeals. The farmers stood in their fields, watching the locusts devour their livelihoods, and realized they had nothing left to fight with. Clara heard the news on her battery-powered radio while she was walking her field at dawn. She stopped in the middle of the blazing star strip, the purple flowers towering over her head, and listened to the announcer's grave voice. "The ban is effective immediately," he said. "Farmers are advised to contact their county extension office for alternative pest management strategies." Clara turned off the radio and looked at her field. The wildflowers were alive with movement. Ladybugs crawled up the milkweed stems. Lacewings hovered in the air. A praying mantis, green as jade, sat on a black-eyed Susan, its head turning slowly, watching. The wheat stood tall and golden, untouched by the swarm that had devastated her neighbors. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if her little strips of prairie could hold back the tide that had swallowed the county. But she knew one thing: she had not used a single chemical. The ban did not touch her. Her farm was still legal, and her field was still green. By the end of the first week of the ban, Butler County looked like a war zone. Fields that had been lush and green in June were now brown wastelands, stripped to the dirt by the locusts and the farmers' desperate attempts to poison them. The grain elevator sat empty. The banks began calling in loans. Earl Jensen sat on his porch with a bottle of bourbon and watched his empire turn to dust. And every single one of them, driving past the Whitmore place on their way to town, saw something that made them stop their trucks and stare. Clara's field was green, not just green, but impossibly, vibrantly, defiantly green. The wheat stood in golden rows, heavy with grain. The wildflower strips blazed with color, purple and yellow and orange and white, and above them the air shimmered with life. Birds by the hundreds, swallows and warblers and sparrows, diving through the locusts like fighter pilots, gorging themselves on the insects. The wildflowers had attracted them, the insects had fed them, and now they were defending the field with a ferocity that nature had designed over millions of years. The locusts came to Clara's field, of course. They came in their thousands, their millions, driven by hunger and instinct. But they found no easy meal. The wildflower strips were dense and complex, not the simple monoculture the locusts preferred. The predatory insects that Clara's flowers had nurtured for months rose up to meet them. The birds fell upon them from above. The spiders wove webs between the milkweed stems, catching the grasshoppers by the dozen. And the locusts, confused and harried and hungry, moved on. They passed over Clara's 40 acres like a storm passing over a mountain, touching down on all sides but leaving the center untouched. It was not magic. It was not miracle. It was ecology, ancient and perfect, working exactly as it had been designed to work, before human beings ever thought to replace it with poison. Earl Jensen came to Clara's porch on the 8th day. He looked 20 years older than he had in March. His eyes were red, his hands shook, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "How?" he asked. "How did you know?" Clara handed him a glass of lemonade. It was her grandmother's recipe, tart and sweet and cold as a winter morning. "I didn't know about the locusts, Mr. Jensen. I didn't know about the ban. I just knew that the land was sick and the flowers were medicine. I sprayed everything," Earl said, staring at his boots. "Every chemical they sold. Every year, more and more. And the bugs kept getting stronger, and the soil kept getting weaker, and I kept paying for more poison. I thought that was farming." "It was," Clara said gently. "It was farming for a while. But the land was trying to tell us something, and we weren't listening." Earl drank his lemonade in silence. When he finished, he set the glass on the porch rail and looked Clara in the eyes for the first time. I've got 600 acres of dead dirt, Miss Whitmore. 600 acres, and a bank that's going to take it all by winter. Is there any way to fix it? Clara looked out at her field where a monarch butterfly was landing on a milkweed blossom, its wings the color of stained glass. There is, she said, but it won't be fast, and it won't be easy. And the first thing you have to do is stop poisoning the patient. That autumn, Clara Whitmore harvested the best wheat crop Butler County had seen in 20 years. Her yields were 30% higher than her father's best year, and the grain tested clean of chemical residue, earning a premium price from an organic buyer in Wichita. She paid off the bank loan with money to spare. She bought a new combine, not shiny, not new, but solid and reliable. And she planted another 4 acres of wildflower strips, expanding her prairie rivers until they covered 15 of her 40 acres. But the real harvest came in the letters. Farmers from across Kansas wrote to her, then from Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas. They had heard about the girl who planted wildflowers and beat the locusts. They had heard about the farm that survived the pesticide ban. They wanted to know how. They wanted to learn. Clara started holding workshops on Saturday mornings, standing in her field with her straw hat on her head and dirt under her fingernails, teaching old farmers and young ones about companion planting and native species and the ancient wisdom of the prairie. Tom Garrett helped her, translating her observations into scientific language, connecting her traditional knowledge with modern research. Dr. Miriam Holt came from Kansas State and walked the field with tears in her eyes, saying over and over, "I knew it could work. I knew it." Earl Jensen was her most surprising student. He sold his combine, paid off what debts he could, and began converting his 600 acres to integrated pest management. It took him 3 years to see a profit again. 5 years before his soil tested healthy, 7 years before he could look Clara in the eye and say, "Without shame, you saved my farm, girl. You saved my life." By then, Clara Whitmore was no longer the crazy girl who planted weeds in her wheat field. She was the founder of the Butler County Prairie Initiative, a consultant to the state agricultural extension, and the author of a small book called The Flower and the Grain, Restoring the Partnership. Her farm had become a research station, a classroom, and a pilgrimage site for farmers who were tired of the chemical treadmill and looking for another way. The wildflower strips spread across the county, then the state, then the region. Farmers who had laughed at Clara now planted blazing star and milkweed in their own fields. The grain elevators, which had sat empty that terrible autumn of 1987, began to fill again, not just with wheat, but with stories of renewal. The birds returned to Butler County by the thousands. The monarch butterflies, whose migration had been dwindling for decades, found a new corridor of milkweed stretching across Kansas like a highway of hope. And every spring, when the first wildflowers opened their faces to the Kansas sun, the old farmers would gather at Clara's field with their grandchildren, and they would tell the story. They would tell how a 19-year-old girl, alone and grieving and laughed at by everyone she knew, had looked at 40 acres of poisoned dirt and seen not an ending but a beginning. They would tell how she had planted wildflowers in her wheat field, not because she was crazy, but because she was brave enough to remember what the rest of them had forgotten. They would tell how the locusts came and the chemicals failed, and the ban took away every weapon the modern world had promised them. They would tell how they had stood in their ruined fields and watched, in disbelief and wonder and a shame that would take years to heal, as one small farm stood green and golden against the destruction. And then they would walk into the field, the children running ahead to chase butterflies, the old men bending down to touch the soil with weathered hands, and they would remember. They would remember that farming was never about conquering the land. It was about listening to it. It was about partnership. It was about planting not just seeds, but trust. Clara Whitmore still walks her field every morning at dawn. She is older now, her hair streaked with silver, her hands gnarled with decades of work, her straw hat replaced by a newer one, though no less weathered. The wildflower strips have grown into a mosaic of prairie and grain, a landscape that changes with the seasons but never loses its life. She still presses her fingers into the soil and breathes deep. She still whispers to the seeds. She still believes, with a faith that has never wavered, that the land knows what it needs, if only we are brave enough to listen. On the fence post at the edge of her field, where the county road meets the dirt driveway, someone has hung a small wooden sign. It was put there by Earl Jensen before he died, a quiet man in his final years who had become Clara's closest friend and fiercest advocate. The sign is weathered now, the paint faded, but the words are still clear. They laughed when she planted flowers, it reads, but the flowers had the last laugh. And every morning, as the sun rises over Butler County and paints the prairie gold, the wildflowers nod in the wind, and the wheat stands tall, and the birds sing, and the soil breathes, and the story lives on, not because one young woman was smarter than everyone else, not because she had some secret that no one else could know, but because she was 19 years old and her heart was broken, and her future was uncertain. And in that desperate, beautiful moment, she chose to trust the land rather than fear it. She chose to plant not just wheat, but hope. Not just grain, but life. And in doing so, she taught an entire county, an entire generation, the oldest truth of all, that the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. And when we serve it with love and patience and the humility to learn, it will serve us in return. Not just with harvests, but with miracles we never dared to dream. The wildflowers still grow at Whitmore Farm. They still blaze purple and yellow and orange against the Kansas sky. They still draw the bees and the butterflies and the birds that keep the fields alive. And every child who visits, every farmer who comes to learn, every stranger who stops their car to stare at the impossible green in the middle of the prairie, hears the same whisper on the wind. It is the sound of a young woman's faith, still growing, still blooming, still proving that the craziest ideas are often the ones that save us, that the things we throw away as worthless are often the most precious, that the laughter of the crowd is just noise, and the truth of the soil is the only music that matters. Clara Whitmore is in her 60s now. She has outlived her critics, outlasted her doubters, and outgrown the need for anyone's approval but the land's. She has trained hundreds of young farmers, consulted on thousands of acres, and planted more wildflowers than she can count. But every spring, when the first milkweed pushes through the soil and the monarchs begin their long journey north, she goes out to her field alone. She kneels in the dirt, just as she did that first morning in March of 1987. She presses her hands into the earth, feeling its warmth, its pulse, its ancient, patient heartbeat, and she whispers the same words she has whispered every year for nearly 40 years. "Thank you," she says. "Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for showing me that the greatest strength is not in fighting the land, but in loving it." The wildflowers sway around her, a sea of color against the golden wheat. And for a moment, the wind is still, and the world is quiet, and the prairie remembers. It remembers the girl who was not crazy, the girl who was brave, the girl who planted flowers in a wheat field and changed everything. And if you drive down County Road 17 on a summer evening, when the sun is low and the light is gold and the air smells of bergamot and grain, you might see her there. An old woman in a straw hat, kneeling in a field of flowers, her hands in the soil, her face turned to the sky. You might wonder what she is doing. You might think she is praying, and you would be right. She is praying to the land that saved her. She is praying to the flowers that taught her. She is praying to the memory of a young woman who was 19 years old and had nothing left but hope, and who discovered that hope, planted in good soil and tended with faith, grows into something stronger than doubt, more powerful than fear, and more enduring than time itself. It grows into a legacy, a lesson. A field of wildflowers in the middle of Kansas, still blazing after all these years, still whispering to anyone who will listen. Trust the earth, plant the flowers, and never, ever let them tell you that weeds cannot become gardens, because they can, because they did, because one young woman, laughed at and mocked and dismissed by everyone who thought they knew better, proved that the oldest wisdom is always the truest, that nature, left to her own devices and helped by a gentle hand, knows exactly what she is doing. That the wildflowers were never worthless. They were waiting for someone brave enough to remember their name. Clara Whitmore remembered, and Butler County will never forget.